Welcome to the Bluestocking Circle podcast, Lady Nerds on Popular Culture. We're your hosts, Griselle,
Bee, and Kat.
This is episode 28, Pride and Prejudice. Today we will be discussing the 1995 and 2005 film adaptations of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. While the book is not required reading for this episode, we will make reference to it throughout because how can we not? Before we begin, know that we will spoil all the things, but really, can one spoil work so thoroughly ingrained in the collective unconscious?
Do we also need a viral infection warning?
Yes, we do! Because Griselle has a cold!
But such is her devotion to Jane Austen that she's here anyway.
I am trying my very best to stay alive for this.
Are you coughing for your own amusement, Griselle?
Yes, only my own. It is amusing to none but me. It is a truth universally acknowledged that every Bluestocking requires an introduction to Pride and Prejudice, and we friends are no different. Printed in 1813, Pride and Prejudice is Jane Austen's second published work. Originally titled First Impressions, it is a 3-volume novel, much like other popular works of the time. It is among the most well-loved books in literary history and continues to inspire adaptations, fanfiction, Etsy creations, and book nerd swag galore. If Bridget Jones is considered the ur-text of women's fiction, I think it's safe to say that Pride and Prejudice is the source behind every enemies to lovers historical and non-historical romance. With rakes and snark and plenty of miscommunication, Pride and Prejudice set the stage for some of the most enduring tropes of genre fiction, and modernized literature for readers thereafter. Really, go read some Frances Burney if you don't believe me. For further discussion of our dear lady author, I refer you to episode 4, Persuasion. But for now, our newbie Kat will tell us what Pride and Prejudice is all about.
Marriage is on everyone's mind at the Bennet household, where the 5 daughters must make good matches, i.e. someone rich, in order to keep their good social standing. Luckily, a pair of handsome, wealthy men take up residence nearby, and hopes are high that the eldest daughter will lock down one of them. But can 2 people from 2 different social classes find happiness? Well, if the women are beautiful, charming, and talented, then yes.
That sounds pretty much like that's it. That's what Pride and Prejudice is all about.
Yeah.
We cannot deny that it is basically a marriage plot where money is at stake.
The more that I watched, each adaptation made it more evident to me that it was just about getting married.
Well, and I think we're going to definitely get into that because I don't know which order of adaptations you decided to watch in, but we did imply before that the order you watched in would inspire your opinions of Darcy very thoroughly.
It did.
First, let's dive into our origin stories. I must admit, but I wish I had a more momentous origin story. The truth is that I avoided a lot of classic literature as a youth, mostly because I was required to read some truly terrible stuff in school that soured me to the whole experience. And I did not really read this until I took it upon myself to engage in a rigorous course of self-improvement when I was in college, because after all, how could I call myself an English major and admit that I had such a gap in my education? So Pride and Prejudice was my introduction to Jane Austen, as I'm sure it is for many readers. After that, I read the rest of her works, including, From Sense and Sensibility to The Letters or What Remain of Them, the unfinished works, and a few biographies as well. But Pride and Prejudice remains my happy favorite, while Persuasion is my tearjerker with a happy ever after. I also, I believe that I mentioned during our Bridget Jones episode, if not, it was maybe our Persuasion episode, that it was Bridget that inspired me to read Pride and Prejudice, which means that my reading order was I read Bridget Jones first, watched the 1995, because obviously, then read the book sometime after that, and the 2005 came out sometime while I was finishing my undergrad and was deep in Victorian literature and into symbolism.
That is an interesting journey through Pride and Prejudice, Griselle.
It is!
As for me, I first encountered Pride and Prejudice in high school in my AP English Literature class. I don't think I was aware that Jane Austen was a thing before then, but we read the book and watched the 1995 miniseries right after. And the only people in the class who enjoyed it were actually me and the substitute teacher, no one else. I think she was really happy to have at least someone in the class to fangirl with about the miniseries. But after that, a friend and I went around calling ourselves Lizzie and Jane, and I'll let you decide who was who. And around that time, we took a Which Pride and Prejudice character are you quiz, and to my shock, my result was Darcy, which I think is pretty accurate. My good opinion, once lost, is lost forever.
I can verify this.
Well, I can't really even explain how I managed to get this far in life without reading Jane Austen. I certainly knew of her by high school and had many friends who read her novels, but I was just never enticed to pick one up. I know I was never assigned to read her books, and that seems to be where most people first encountered her writing, so that's some small explanation for how I missed it. But I know that I certainly read other classics on my own time, so there must have been some reason that I was just avoiding Jane Austen. And if I'm to be totally honest, I think part of it is that they always just seemed like cheery British romances to me, and that wasn't really my cup of tea.
I found that to be a very amusing description of what these are.
I don't know, just like thinking about the covers of them all, they're always like very like soft focus.
I think it really depends on which covers you saw. You were probably exposed to some of the old art covers, which are very interesting in their depiction.
Probably.
I think that actually that comment about the covers takes us in an interesting direction because, as we'll probably discuss, the versions take a very different adaptation. And I think that influences how we understand the story itself. But do we have any general discussion before we get started?
I do. On that note, Grisel, one of the things that I love that's different between the 1995 and 2005 adaptations is how the different actors play or interpret Darcy. Firth plays him like a completely arrogant jerk, and I want to punch him in the face for the first half of the miniseries at least. But McFadden plays him like a socially awkward puppy in my opinion, and I just think he's adorable. I don't find him very arrogant or unpleasant in that movie as I do in the miniseries. I really like the McFadden interpretation, even though I think the Firth one is more accurate to his portrayal in the book. So what are your thoughts and preferences?
I never actually paid much attention to the interpretation of Darcy until you briefly mentioned your perceptions during our minisode.
Oh.
And I can definitely see this now. I think that there's a shy, introvert, socially awkward dynamic that the Darcy of the 2005 has, which works for that adaptation. I also noticed as I was watching it, and it had been a few years since I had seen this version, that overall the 2005 tones down what I think of as a lot of the irony and bite of the book, and the 95 one really plays it up, which might be that like very arrogant, snipey sort of Darcy that we see. And I remember reading somewhere that Colin Firth was directed to act as if he has an erection every time that Lizzie is in the room, which I imagine would be uncomfortable for all parties involved, but especially an uppity Darcy. They wore very tight pants back then. And I also even found that in the 2005, everyone is slightly more sympathetic, even Mr. Collins. He comes across as just kind of like a blundering, sad guy who doesn't really know what he wants, but he's just meeting like the social norms. He has that little flower scene. He loves his excellent potatoes. It's like, he's not the annoying person of the 95 one, which...
I think he is.
Well, but I don't know. I find him a little gentler.
I find him more pathetic.
Yes, he's very pathetic.
Yeah, but that elicits sympathy more than the 95 version.
It's like, you poor misguided soul. More so than like, oh god, you're so annoying. How can anyone put up with you?
I do think that the 2005 version does a better job of setting up the romance between the characters, and I think a lot of that has to do with the more gentle portrayal of Darcy. But I do think that the way that Colin Firth plays him is how I imagined him in the book.
Do you think Jane Austen was writing with that direction in mind?
I don't know. She was a wise lady of her time.
Well, speaking of the tight pants of the time period, I didn't know a whole lot about the Regency era, so I did a little research, and it mostly revolved around the fashions of the time. And one thing that it made me realize was that the fashion of the time was going through a really strange period, and I think it sort of sets up why there's so many Regency era romances. Because if you look at the clothing of that time, it's actually very simplistic and not a lot of clothing on the body for women. They're wearing like very light things, very inspired by like Greek statues. So sort of drapey fabrics that clung to the body. You could actually, because they were also wearing different undergarments and like not giant hoop skirts or insanely body modifying corsets, you could actually see the shape of a woman pretty well in their dresses.
Sometimes they were see-through and like purposely made see-through, so you could literally see their shape.
Yeah, it was like very gauzy. Mm-hmm. And so it made me realize too, like, oh, it's so like sensual.
It is.
And like, you could actually like standing next to someone, like actually feel their body. Whereas like when people are wearing hoop skirts and like a lot of like poofy fabrics and giant sleeves, there's so much there between the people that I was like, I get it.
I think that's actually one of the interesting liberties that the 2005 takes. There's that one scene in the book. It's when Lizzie, and also in the 95, it's when Lizzie sees the portraits of Wickham and Darcy. In the 2005, they're marbles.
Yeah.
And this is the time, I'm not 100% certain on my dates, but this is the time around when the Elgin marbles, whose actual name I forget, but they were, basically stolen from the Greeks and taken to the British Museum. So this is where a lot of this inspiration comes from for that very throwback to the Greeks and the Romans and the flowies and the lots of nudity. And it's a very sexually charged scene for, what is a very proper book. Like, you don't picture Lizzie, really, maybe going through this marble area or whatever you want to call it and looking at all these nudes. But that was a thing that people were very much interested in at the time. And I just thought it was quite interesting that it did that. Like, I think that 2005 adds a subtle sexuality that is not quite there in the 95, not in the same way.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot more like physical emphasis in the 2005. I don't even want to say, they don't even really touch that much, but there's just like emphasis on his hands, on her hands, on like their bodies. And it makes it, I think that is because they play up the romance so much. But it was interesting. So one thing that was happening while I was watching the 2005, because I had just done all this research and was like looking at Regency era fashions and interior designs for homes, the 2005 is not a Regency era time period.
No.
And it really was throwing me off in the beginning. I didn't know what was happening. I was just like, these outfits are wrong. These houses are wrong.
The houses are so wrong.
Everything
I'm going to cathartic about this later.
It was, I didn't know what to think. I was just like, why would they do this? What is happening? But then I was reading that the director, partially because he didn't like Regency fashions, including the Empire waist, which I also don't like. So I understand.
It makes everyone look pregnant.
It's so weird. So he wanted to set it in like the 1790s, and he realized that that was when Jane Austen actually wrote the first edition or the first version of it. So he was like, oh, this gives me reason to set it earlier and not in this Regency time period.
Onto a flimsy reason and use it.
But it is strange. Although part of the Empire waist thing, even though it does make everyone look pregnant, it does allow for women to actually like move and do physical activities because it's like a lot less restrictive than other clothing. And it actually allowed physical movements for women so they could, do things outside, go riding on horses, go for long walks even, which you could not do if you were wearing a very tight corset. So it's just a brief period of time for like fashion history that the dresses and garments were like this for women, and you don't really see it again until almost the 1920s, which is sort of like a revival of feminism and allowing women to have sportswear and like more freeing clothing.
It also goes back like with Art Nouveau and all that, to a lot of those same lines.
Exactly,
being revived.
Right, and like kind of going back to the Greek ideals and things like that. So.
Yeah, it's also a very brief period of time just historically as well, because the Regency was very, very short in English history, but it inspired so much.
Yeah, that was one thing I didn't realize either, was just like what a short period of time it was. I think it was also kind of a time of like a burgeoning youth culture, and I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that it was a prince running things, and he was not expecting to take over the country while his father was still alive. And so, I don't know, even just the brief that I know about that time is mostly from the life of Mary Shelley. Which, and I don't know.
And it inspired basically like the whole romantic movement. So, which was a response to like, get down with the man in its own weird way. So like, it was its own little youth culture era. You had all these like young poets up to no good and Mary Shelley sleeping on gravestones.
Yes, exactly. And sort of like the Byron Shelley-esque like free love, and we're all just gonna like not be tied to social standing.
A lot of shenanigans happening at that time. Okay, so I could keep going about Regency era fashions ad nauseum, but let's transition and return to this later.
Okay.
So let's dive into our ship wars. This being, as we noted, basically a marriage plot novel, there are all manner of ships. There's a lot of relationships that get brought together and torn apart, and a lot of interrelational drama that happens. But I think, rather than going into just another discussion of like why Lizzie and Darcy are right or wrong for each other, I thought it might be interesting to go into some of the tropes that basically Jane Austen set into genre for years to come. Because she is not the creator of these tropes, but I would say that she definitely popularized them. If you've ever read any fiction of Jane Austen's time that is not written by Jane or Mary Shelley, it's very different. It's very rambly. There's a lot of like stuff that happens to people, usually girls who are naive. There's a lot of pedantic stuff going on, and it's very didactic. And it's not fun literature per se. Jane Austen definitely took that and turned it into something completely different. So in many ways we have her to thank for how fiction was modernized. And among that is those very traditional tropes that we see nowadays of, like what we think of in the romance genre as the rake, the alpha, and the beta heroes, which is what you see in Wickham, Darcy, Bingley. And if you've read, obviously, Sense and Sensibility, it's the same tropes she was already playing with there, because you've got Willoughby, who's your rake. You have Edward Ferrars, who's your somewhat of a beta hero, but also I don't know. And then you've got your Colonel Brandon, who's definitely a beta hero. So it's your tropes of you've got your bad boy that everybody wants and will somehow be proven to be not the right choice. Your alpha, who's your very strong, manly, traditional type, who's your Darcy in this case. And your beta, who's your gentle cinnamon roll of a boy who sometimes needs a bit of a push to express himself and realize what's really going on. Sometimes Bingley is exasperating to me in particular, whereas I think I'm more forgiving of some of Edward Ferrars's poor decision-making. Bingley is just come on, man, make a decision. Stop being so wishy-washy on what you want. But these are tropes that I think were established here and continue to be very enduring in not just romance, but in all manner of other mediums. You see this in TV all the time. You've got, your heroine who's oh, I like the bad boy. But
your Jackson, your Sawyers.
Yes, yes, exactly. It's just that. It's a trope that continues to endure and you see across all manner of mediums. What do you guys think?
One thing that I was surprised about, actually, a sort of trope that I thought was going to come into play, was the idea of sort of courting a new person in order to make the other person jealous. I definitely at some point thought that after Darcy gets turned down that he was going to find someone who is of his social set, but obviously the wrong choice, and sort of court her, and then Elizabeth would see that, and that's what would make her realize that she was in love with him, because I feel that gets played out. And I was pleasantly surprised that didn't happen. And
it
I was
his house.
Yeah, it was just the house.
I think I could see where, as a reader, you might start to think that maybe that would have been the Caroline Bingley situation, because it kind of sets it up as she's the foil for Lizzie, and it doesn't happen, which I guess is a very good thing, because we don't need to pit women against each other in that way. Yeah.
And it was just no, he likes Elizabeth, and he likes her. He's not trying to play with her emotions, and he's not trying to be with someone else just because he can't have her. So
I think if that happened, the book wouldn't be as enduring as it is. I think part of Darcy's appeal is his loyalty to Elizabeth even after she rejects him. If he had immediately gone with another woman to court her instead, I don't think Darcy would be hailed as a romantic hero today, and I don't think the book would have the legacy that it does.
That's true. Yeah.
I think there is a very brief subplot. I think it kind of gets glossed over a bit in the 2005. The 95 spends a little bit more time on it, but it's so small that you can totally miss it, where Wickham is briefly engaged to Mary King.
Were they engaged?
They are in some sort of agreement. I'm not yet in that part of the book, because I did start rereading the book after watching the films, so I haven't gotten back to that part of the book, but there is some sort of understanding. And I assume that in the story, Mary King's family probably in some way convinces her, this is not a good choice for you, and that gets dissolved. But
they did note that she was whisked away by her uncle, I believe, in the 95.
Yes. So there's brief mention of it in the two films. I think that's where you kind of get into that area of, your rake, who is not a great model to look upon as manly courtesy or anything. So it does kind of pit the women against each other a little bit. Because at one point, in the 95 even, he kind of comes back and goes, oh, sorry about that. And he says something to that nature to Lizzie. And then it's when he marries Lydia, it's see, sorry, ladies. It's okay, dude, you clearly have some issues here. I also wanted to bring up, I think the 2005 and the 95 especially treat the wrap-up happily ever after of the different characters in very different ways. I find that especially, not just with the way in which Lizzie and Darcy are presented, but also I think especially how Lydia and Wickham's happy ever after, or whatever ever after happens, is very different in how the 95 treats it versus the 2005. In the 2005, there's a moment where she's in the carriage, and that's the last time you see Lydia in that film. And she's riding and she's waving to her family, and he yanks her down into the carriage. I can't tell if she's being yanked or if she just falls, but I kind of got the impression watching it this time that it's he gets kind of exasperated with her and yanks her down into the carriage. Whereas in the 95, it's well, they're kind of two dissolute people who have kind of found each other, and you kind of assume they'll be okay in some way. Lydia is probably just gonna keep on being her usual self. And I like the idea of Lydia just being like her usual, like somewhat dissolute self, but happy in that. I kind of like that idea, like that Lydia she's not the model of domestic womanhood that this time period would want you to have. And there is that little bit of pedanticness in Jane Austen too, where it's like, you should not be like Lydia. And it's like, Lydia seems to be enjoying herself quite thoroughly the whole time. So, her life's not going to be perfect, but I think the 95 kind of shows that. Like, she's just in bed with Wickham, and it's like, you seem to be enjoying your somewhat shady marriage situation. So I thought that was interesting. But Lizzie Darcy is also very different as presented. Like, the 95 does the classic kiss at the end, and that's it, fade to black.
But we have a special ending in the 2005 version just for us Americans. Crystal, I don't think you knew this until I mentioned it.
I did not. I had no idea, because I had only ever seen one version.
Perhaps you know this, Kat, but the ending of the 2005 version that you saw, the one with Lizzie and Darcy at Pemberley, is only in the American version, because we like our happy endings here at the States. In England, in the original version, it ends with Mr. Bennet giving his approval to the engagement, but you don't see them married, ever.
That's a horrible way to end it, because even the book takes you to the wedding. Like, come on.
Yeah, and in the book, you're right, you at least get a little bit of them sort of how they would be in their relationship, I'll say. So you have some understanding of, like, their life after this book. So if it just ended there, that would be very...
That would be unsatisfying.
Yes, that's, like, too abrupt.
I agree, but I also think the ending that we got is a little bit too soppy.
Yeah, I'm not crazy about that ending. I don't know what... That table is weird that they're sitting on. It was driving me crazy. She's touching his leg, which was like, what is happening?
Yes, it's a little too far. And there's ankles and calves. Like, there's so much happening here.
Clutching my pearls. Like, what? Bare skin? Yeah, it was kind of a lot. And then it was, it's like 0 and 100. Like, you get to see them and they realize they're in love and they're going to get married. And then all of a sudden they're just like very sappy, poetic, talking about like how happy they are. And just like, it was a little much.
I agree.
Yeah.
It's very different. I would say that somewhere in between the two is probably my happy middle. Like,
yeah. I forget the exact part. In the book, she's talking, I think maybe to his sister. And they're talking about their relationship. But she mentioned something about how they can laugh with each other. And I was like, oh, that's it. Like, that's the thing that kind of binds them together. And I appreciate that. And I don't really feel like either version actually captured that. And that kind of goes into sort of my issues is I don't really understand what Darcy sees in Elizabeth. I don't get it. I don't know. I guess it's just that she's beautiful, but like she's obviously funny and charming and witty, but he doesn't really seem to ever appreciate those qualities about her.
I have a hypothesis. She's not like other girls.
Yes!
I think that's it.
Yes, that is exactly it. She is the original not like other girls.
Right.
She gets her hands dirty. She walks. She has those fine eyes that are brightened by exercise.
Yes.
Right, exactly. Yeah, so it was just like, I guess that's it. Like, she's different, and she also seems... I think it's also that thing, which I don't like either, is that she is the only person who's ever said no to him. Where, like, she rejects him sort of by turning down a dance, and he doesn't ever, like, get that. And then, obviously, rejects his proposal. But I don't like that idea either. That, like, oh, by her saying no, it just means that I like her even more, and now I'll have to have her. And it's just like,
He's a more subtle Mr. Collins in that regard.
Yes.
More subtle Mr. Collins.
There, that's my controversial opinion of the day. Mr. Darcy is a subtle Mr. Collins.
Oh my God. With less religion and Fordyce's sermons.
Yeah.
We don't know his opinion on potatoes.
No, we don't. We do not.
So yeah, I don't really see what he sees in her. And then I sort of appreciated that in the 95 version, they make it very blatant that she falls in love with him after seeing his house. And I was like, is that it? Is that why she likes him? And I get that, like, later she does sort of develop feelings and she sees, you know, his relationship with his sister and she sees how he is willing to help her and her family and those kinds of feelings develop. But, like, she outright just says it in the 95 version. Like, that's when she started to fall for him. And I was just like, this doesn't make me feel good.
I always took that as just her being sarcastic because that's, like, the expectation. I think also the films, especially if if you see the 2005 first, or if that's the only one you know, it really shortens the amount of time that these people spend together.
Yes.
They spend a pretty long period of time together when Jane is sick.
That's true.
I think it's like almost like 2 weeks of time or something that they're like basically alone in a house with only like 3 other people. So they spend a lot of time to get to like feel each other out, which I think the films definitely gloss over. The 2005, more so obviously because of the constraints of a feature film, whereas the 95, it's technically a miniseries, so they had more time to develop these characters. They spend a significant amount of time together there at Rosings, and they also spend a significant
Because
amount
he
of time...
stalks her there?
Well, I think by that point also, she's started to soften towards him a little bit, at least in terms of like respecting him as a human, if not necessarily like being attracted to him. So you kind of start to see the dynamic developing. I think of these two people as people who can bounce off of each other pretty well, and neither has ever had that challenge before. Because you also get in the book that in the Bennet household, Lizzie is one of the smarter ones, according to her father. She only really, I guess, has her father to, like, bounce ideas off of sometimes. The other sisters are not the brightest. Jane is the prettiest. She's not the smartest. The other two are kind of vapid. And Mary is made herself smart because she chooses to make herself accomplished in this way. It's brought up more than once that she is very pedantic and didactic, and she chooses to be...
She's a Bluestocking.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say she's a Bluestocking, because I wouldn't feel that Mary would be good at sharing her ideas with other people or coming together to form community. Mary just wants to be overbearing and like tell people that she's right about stuff. Like, that's how I
How was
read
that
her.
not us?
Yeah.
So I just think that being a Bluestocking would be more of like coming together and having open ideas and discussion, whereas she kind of just wants to be like, I read these sermons and I'm right about these things. But
I feel like if she had someone who is willing to listen to her, but she's just always getting shut down from everyone.
Middle child syndrome.
I feel for her and I relate to her.
She's the original Jen Brady.
Yes, and just like everyone's always just like rolling their eyes, even when she has good points to make. I'm like, listen to Mary sometimes. It's not all about just getting married. Like, maybe sometimes you should like look at the larger situation, because everyone's just like caught up in like gossip and interpersonal relationships, and I think she's like bringing sort of larger ideas into it, but no one wants to listen to her.
Since when ship wars, can we talk about this weird decision the adaptations make to give her a crush on Mr. Collins?
Yeah, I think I did notice it in both. I think it's more obvious in the 2005, although later episodes of the 95, they do have a lot of her like looking longingly at him. And I guess because he's like another pedantic character who's just like spouting his own ideas, that they thought that that would be a good match, but she deserves much better than him. He was weird.
yeah, I think that the idea that they both share their interest in Fordyce is like the thing that brings them together.
I do like Jane and Bingley. I think they're sweet.
I do too. I think that they sort of work well together. I like the assessment of Mr. Bennet at the end, where he's just saying that they're both so compliant, that servants will always take advantage of them, and they're just so nice. I was like, yeah, they're just nice.
Before we leave ship wars, Griselle, how on earth did Mr. and Mrs. Bennet happen? In the 2005, you see a bit of remaining affection between them at some points, but in the 95 and in the book, how on earth did that come about?
I have my theories about this. My one pet peeve, though, I will point out first, is that both the 2005 and the 95 age these characters up way too much. Mrs. Bennet should only be about 40-something years old. Mrs. Bennet was a Lydia in her youth, is what you get the impression. And Mr. Bennet was definitely attracted to her because of probably her looks. At one point, he even tells her when he's like joking about her going to the Bingleys, he's like, maybe you shouldn't go with the daughters. You're still good looking yourself. So you get the impression that she was attractive. She was probably impetuous. He didn't think too much. He also admits that like they've basically blown through their money for the most part. She came with a greater fortune than he did. He came with the entailed house, and they kind of maybe just were their own little version of Wickham and Lydia.
Yeah, I think he sort of has a satirical eye about the people around him, and he's always sort of like making jokes about people, and he like says specifically to Lizzie a few times, like, that's what we do. We like sit back and reread the letters and we laugh at our neighbors. So I feel like he definitely had sort of a more happy-go-lucky attitude, and if she was sort of more of a Lydia who was like a little more wild, that I could see them coming together, because it's like two people who maybe don't fit in with their set.
I would also add that we have to look back at how marriage worked at this time, where you were pretty much if you were of this class, you were brought out into society around the time that you were like maybe 15, 16, and you were expected to get married by the time you were 21. If you were not married, you were firmly on the shelf, which is what we see happen to Charlotte Lucas. And so if Mrs. Bennet, whatever her name was, I can't remember now, before she was married, if she was a pretty girl and she was introduced in these balls and they had 3 or 4 conversations, that was pretty much it. You were good. If you could at least like have a couple of conversations with this person, you were at least relatively attracted to each other, you were probably going to walk down the aisle. And so I can see them just being like, you look good. I like you. You got money. I got money. Let's get together.
Yeah, I sort of imagine that they were like that, brought together by unofficial matchmaking set, like going to balls, and then there would be like the chaperones and the older people, and they would say, oh, you know what, these people would make a good couple. And they were kind of brought together. And I feel like they kind of made the best out of it. Mm-hmm. I feel like they actually sort of enjoy each other's company.
They made 5 girls.
I think that...
They were trying for a boy, so you imagine more happened there.
I think the movies make it seem much more harsh. But when I was reading the books, I was like, oh, they're sort of like that couple that will like harp on each other, but in the end, actually, they do care about each other. And that's why every time that she's like nagging him to do something, and
he does it anyhow.
Sometimes he's already done it without her even asking.
He just likes to tease
her. He's
her.
just holding out, right? So I was like, oh, that's just fun and sweet. They're having fun with each other.
I don't see them as having a dysfunctional relationship in any way. I just think, they're slightly different, and they get joy out of kind of riling each other up.
Yeah, that's how I saw it.
So I think this leads us very nicely into feminist strength. One of the things that I was thinking of as I was watching the films and as I started reading the book again is that as I've gotten older and come to understand these characters more and, dare I say, become less romantic myself, I've come to feel like I should stand staunchly in defense of Charlotte Lucas and Caroline Bingley as 2 of what I feel are the more realistic characters in this novel. We want to root for Darcy and Lizzie and Bingley and Jane because they're lovely and perfect and blah, blah, blah. But the reality is that a lot of the women of this time were experiencing what Charlotte experiences. She's 27. She's not married. She's already becoming a burden on her family. You get a little bit more about her father's background in the book, where he's described as, he had a shop or something in town. He earned his money. He got a knighthood, and he decided to become a man of leisure because suddenly he was a sir. And so you know that this girl is completely dependent on living in her family home. And the day that daddy dies, there's nothing there for her. There's no money being entailed upon her. She's not going to have a living of any sort. So what do? You either get married or you become a sad character in one of Jane Austen's other novels.
Or you become a governess and go into a gothic novel, which would have been my pet.
But let's be realistic, too. The life of the governess was pretty dreadful for most actual governesses, Jane Eyre's notwithstanding.
It was pretty dreadful for her for a while, too. It was a pretty dreadful
life for many. The service was not necessarily, something to aspire to if you were of a certain class. And so it's just kind of like, a sad existence. There's this whole idea of like, oh, Charlotte Lucas, she marries Collins because, she's so desperate. And it's like, well, yeah, she wants a home. She wants to not live in her family's estate until, she's basically left without a choice. So I'm really forgiving towards Charlotte and think she's a much more sympathetic character. The 2005 plays her up a bit more sympathetically, but, the 2005 leaves her as like kind of, well, I kind of just fiddle around and we barely spend any time together because that's all I can do. And as we mentioned earlier, Caroline Bingley becomes the character also that could kind of be pitted against Lizzie. I'm glad that she is not. But there's also a sense in the book as well that Caroline is like money hungry, maybe, or like, a social climber. Like she wants Darcy for herself. She's always trying to make him see her by tearing down Lizzie. And it's also, well, yeah, because again, lady of a certain status, gotta get married if you want to keep it, because her brother's gonna run through his money once he's married. There's no, like, depending upon your brothers, as we learn in Sense and Sensibility.
And I think with Caroline, and now I'm forgetting her other sister's name.
Mrs. Hurst.
Mrs. Hurst. So she's already married, and her husband is the worst. Mm-hmm. He's awful. He's drunk all the time. He just lays around. So I could really see if you're Caroline, you're just like, I cannot have that. Like, I just want someone who's not that, and I know I have to get married, and I don't want to just be forced into a marriage with a rich, old drunk.
Yeah. And she's known Darcy for a while. We don't know how long him and Bingley have been friends, but you know that there's been a pretty well-established relationship between the two families.
Yeah, and that was certainly like a reasonable expectation that she had. That, right, this is a good friend of her brother's. They're from like a certain upper class, society set. That probably would be a good match. Well, I will add to that a defense of Mary.
Yay.
I think that I am Mary in this book.
You're not Mary.
I think I'm Mary too.
Oh my god. Neither of you is Mary.
I have a much more sympathetic view of Mary. I feel like she just wants to talk about books and music, and that's all I ever want to talk about as well. And nobody ever wants to listen to that. And I just don't want to like sit around talking about relationships ad nauseum. So every time that she's like cutting into like their relationship talk, I'm like, yes, please, something, anything else. And I really felt and related so much to Mary. Whenever she would play the piano at a party or social gathering, and everyone is like rolling their eyes and they just want her to play happy, upbeat dance music, because I have been that person.
So what we're seeing is personal trauma.
Yes. I can't tell you, I would make very specific playlists and like pick out songs and then commandeer the audio setup at a party and play all of my music, and people would roll their eyes and I would get mad that everyone is talking over my perfectly selected song list. And then people would just want me to play popular stuff, and I'm just like, you don't understand how good this playlist is. So I am Mary.
Oh my god.
In conclusion.
That's hilarious.
I love that story, Kat.
That was excellent. I too defend Mary, to be honest, but I think she's also got a lot of growing up to do, because poor child has been, like, between the excitable young ones and the older, more expectation-laced ones, and she just needs to come into her own.
She's the odd one out. No one cares about her in that family. Yeah. They ignore her. Lizzie and Jane have each other. Kitty and Lydia have each other. Mm-hmm. Mary has no one. Exactly. She has her books and piano. That's it.
Yeah, she has like no partner in crime.
That's true. I think that brings me to another point that I wanted to make. As I was watching the 2005 in particular, it brought me back to especially the scenes in I Captured the Castle, where we have Cassandra and Rose sleeping in the same bed and chatting with each other and dreaming up like, oh no, these men are coming, and talking to Miss Blossom. Was that the name of the
yes
of the dressmaker's dummy thing? And it brought me back to that, especially the way that the 2005 depicts sisterhood and those very ideas that were explored in I Captured the Castle of, you got the rich men moving in, suddenly you've got these like possibilities that you've got to scheme for, and it was just interesting to me.
On that note, Kat, did reading Pride and Prejudice change your perception of I Capture the Castle?
Actually, I think it made me appreciate it even more. And I liked it at the time, even though I didn't fully understand it. But I think that it actually does do a good job of taking in the Austen elements of romance and being set up into marriage, and the darker sort of gothic elements of a Bronte novel. And I think it merges them really well together. I think it actually kind of is a nice balancing act.
Yeah, it's one of those, things that after watching it again, I was like, oh yeah, that she really did play really well off of these two very different types of literary tropes, and bring them together.
With Pride and Prejudice, there were so many scenes of Jane and Lizzie talking together, but it was always about men, always about marriage. And I was just like, please, for the love of God, talk about something else, a book, art, anything, gardening, what are you passionate about? And so I appreciate, and it made me look back on I Capture the Castle. And I was like, you know what? Those two sisters had full characterization separate from the relationship to men and separate from each other. And I was like, yes, that was well done. I need that balancing.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too, because it also, I Capture the Castle brings out that like very predatory nature of what's happening in Pride and Prejudice that you don't think about, because it's, as you said, depicted as your cheery British romance. Yes. It's like, these are very predatory things that are happening here. Like, we gotta capture a man.
Right.
We need to make a good match.
That's it. I like that. I capture the man.
Like, that one, mine.
It's true. And I was like, very understanding of Darcy's hesitancies when he's seeing Bingley fall for Jane after such a short time period, and seeing how Mrs. Bennet and even the sisters, how everyone is acting. And I'm just like, yeah, they're being ridiculous. You should warn your friend. Like, this is all too much.
But I will also add, to wrap this up and lead us into our next segment, that the 2005's version of sisterhood under the looming threat of poverty as depicted in this film was one of my biggest pet peeves, because while yes, there is the threat that the house will be entailed. These people are not poor. Like, what is up with this? Like, it is a reality and I capture the castle. It's not the case in Pride and Prejudice. So, let us begin our catharsis corner. So, as I was saying, I like the 2005 overall. I think it's a very well done film. I think it's beautifully directed. The scenes are amazing. Like, some of the styling choices are questionable to me, but overall, I enjoy this film. I could not get behind a few things. One of which is the extreme depiction of poverty that is, like, what? Why? The Bennets are not this poor. Why are there geese and pigs roaming through their yard? That's not what this farm looks like. And why is it that they always look slightly sweaty? Like, they're always just a little disheveled and slightly damp. And I could not get this decision.
Speaking of being disheveled, what was happening with everyone's hair?
Oh
Everyone
my God!
looked so unkempt.
Everyone's hair, the bangs.
What is happening? Not just the women, the men too.
Everybody.
What is with Darcy's little wispy bang and Bingley's like just straight up? Like, no, I want to see some 1800.
I want a false front.
Like pompadour. Yes, like I want big hair, curly things, little sausage curls on the women. Like, what is this?
Your weird little like wooden curls that they used to wear.
And it's just like, it was very distracting to me.
It's very distracting to me too. The most distracting thing to me is always Jenna Malone as Lydia, who I just do not think is a good choice for that character. Nor do I really care for how she plays Lydia. But she is the sweatiest of all.
I know, they're all so moist and damp all the time. I don't know. And this was kind of making me think of, actually, I Capture the Castle, because I thought that the 2005 version was much more Bronte-esque. There's so many scenes of just like cliffs and rainy scenes, and they're just like always walking in like a misty, long field, and it just felt very Bronte-esque.
It's very Victorian.
Yes.
As I said when describing my origin story, when I was first watching this, I was deep into sensational Victorian fiction. And my professor, when this film came out, like, we had like a whole side rant just about this film, about why it is beautiful, but why is it pulling in all these tropes that are super Victorian and not at all Regency, which are the sweeping cliffs, the rain, which is a high sexual charge sort of symbolism in Victorian literature. Like, there's all this stuff going on that's like, I think you just like weren't quite sure which era to play with. And you just
I have an answer to all of your questions. The movie is the way it is because it was made for me. That's it.
They put it into a blender and served it up just for you.
These are all the right things to mix together. But yes, it is very Victorian. Those are...
Yes. It was just very off-putting, I guess. And I just wanted it to be a little more... The thing that I like the best about the book is the snippy social commentary. Like, I want cutting remarks about stuffy rich people. And that's why, like, I felt like each adaptation, I read the book, and then I watched the 95, and then I watched the 2005, and that got, like, reduced in every version. And so by the end, I was just like, I can't handle just talking about romance without cutting remarks.
Yeah, that's definitely, I think, it gets diluted by the time you get to the 2005. They really brought it down to just its most essential parts and added some rain.
The snarky wit does get diluted with each version that you mentioned, Kat. And the romantic sweeping Victorian aspects do get played up, and for some reason that really, really works for me. I love Lizzie standing on that cliff. I love the scene when they're dancing and everyone in the room disappears and it's just them two finishing the dance alone to show their internal mindsets at that moment. I love everything about this movie. I love the rain. I love the proposal. I love everything. So I want that on the record because there is one person who fanatically loves this movie and has seen it 100 times. And for once, it's me. I'm not the one hating it.
I mean, I have no hate for this film. I will say that of the many things that happen in this film, the one thing that is very accurate to its time is all the walking that happens, because walking in Regency fiction is like code for the exertion of being very sexually attracted to someone. So
I have a fun fact. Did you know that in that scene at the end where Darcy is walking across the field to meet Lizzie, he couldn't see where he was going because he wasn't wearing his glasses or his contacts. So they had to have a big red flag and wave it so that he could walk towards the flag.
Oh no.
That's hilarious. How do you know all these facts about Matthew Macfadyen?
I am very into this movie, and I have seen all the behind-the-scenes specials, and I have read all the trivia.
Oh. Maybe that's why he looks so befuddled, because he's not wearing his glasses throughout the whole thing. That's kind of cute.
Speaking of him, I think that he does a good job, but some of the other casting just seems strange to me. Mm-hmm. The Wickham in particular in the 2005.
Did you know he's Prince Albert in the Young Victoria?
Oh. I don't think he's a good Wickham.
No.
He doesn't even look like a military man. He just looks so strange. I don't know. There's something about him that I was just like, that's him?
To me, he's like the knockoff Orlando Bloom.
Yeah. But I also thought that the Bingley was an odd casting choice. I really liked the Bingley in the 95 version. I have to say. I looked him up. I wanted to see other things with him.
Too.
Is he in relation to Helena Bonham Carter?
He is. Yes. That's what I was looking up. Because I was like, oh yeah, that name. Is he related? He's like a third cousin or something.
Yeah. And he doesn't seem to have been in that much, actually.
No, he stopped acting. But he is also...
He's a teacher, isn't he?
He is something like that. Yeah, I don't know if he's still married, but he was married to the one who plays his sister Hurst.
Really?
Oh.
Yes.
Wow. Well, I thought he was great. He was very good. In the Bingley in the other version, in the 2005 version, he also comes across as sort of like a sad little puppy dog who's kind of lost. And between him and Darcy being like that, I'm just like, what is this friendship? Who's leading who? You both grew up, like, rich and in society. Like, somehow neither one of you know how to talk to people. Like, what?
But I think he's so adorable with his moppy little red hair.
I do like his red hair. I think that it was a cute choice to have a ginger.
Yeah, okay, I can sign on with that.
I love that scene where he's practicing proposing to Darcy before he goes to talk to Jane. It's adorable.
That was a cute, yes. And I think that he and Jane, I think that they had chemistry. I thought that they were good together. I just, wanted a little more. I thought that the way that the Bingley was in the 95 was a good version of sort of, unsure of himself, but still,
He's very eager.
Yeah, but still, a man of a certain, social set where he knows what to do in a situation and he knows how to talk to people and he's gonna make people comfortable.
Do we have any other things to get off our chests?
2. 1, my feelings on the marriage plot are well established.
Yes,
you can get the full rant of that in episode 4, Persuasion. And 2, I dislike Colin Firth and frankly do not see his appeal. Would you like to explain it to me?
I mean, it's very hard to convince somebody to like something that they're not into.
Yeah. The white shirts and the lake, I don't understand that. It's a dirty lake. It looks gross. It's more like a pond, really.
Well, it's an English lake, so yeah.
Yeah. I like sideburns.
That's it. I don't like sideburns.
I like a sideburn too.
Sideburns very well.
I like a broody eyebrow.
Yes, I like an eyebrow. I like a sideburn. I like good thick hair on a guy, and he has good hair, and Bingley also has good hair. So I think in that version, I was just yeah, the men's hair in this is good.
I think it needs to be your thing.
I think I prefer the blue-eyed puppy version.
Yeah, I like a dark and broody.
Yeah.
There we go. We've expressed our personal preferences. Now we can move on.
So now that we've thoroughly discussed these films, shall we head into our sock ratings? Kat, would you like to lead us?
Yes. So I'm just going to add a little disclaimer because I feel like I'm in sort of a unique position where I consumed all 3 of these in a very short period of time.
Well done.
And it was a lot.
Had the English major experience.
Yes, I was really in deep with these. And I think that my enjoyment levels kept going down with each version that I consumed. And so I'm willing to say with these ratings that perhaps if I had spent more time in between reading and then viewing, that maybe I would have liked each version more, or that maybe in the future I'll look back on these and appreciate them more. But watching them all together, yeah. So with that being said, for the book, I give 4 socks. When I first started reading it, I found it a little off-putting. It's sort of abrupt. The way that the chapters end, and it's sort of very formal in its writing, it was kind of throwing me off. But then around the time in the book where Collins shows up, I really started to enjoy it because there was a lot more of that sort of cutting society humor. And I really like the character of Collins. I don't like him as a person. I just think that he's a good character that brings a lot of humor to the book. So once he shows up and that gets more into that, I was enjoying it a lot more. And I also realized just how early these books were written and how sort of early in the form of novels these books were written.
Yes.
And there wasn't really a lot to kind of go on. And the idea of a novel was very new at the time.
Yeah, she's totally making up this entire format. There's no books before this that look like this.
And what you were saying, too, about, like, books at that time were, like, very moralistic and sort of, like, pedantic and just, like, going on and on. And so it made me appreciate this much more, like, sort of seeing it with that eye of just how early it was written.
Would you read more Austen?
I think I would, because I have to say, as soon as I read this book, I started to pick up on references in pop culture that I had just been missing this whole time. And so I feel like if I read more, I would be even more aware, obviously, of all of these references. And for me, I really like that. And I do appreciate sort of seeing the roots of all of these like influences. So for the 95 version, I give it 3 socks. I thought it's a really good adaptation. It really, like, stays true to the book. And I feel like if you never read the book and only saw this adaptation, you would walk away sort of having a pretty good comprehension of all of the themes. I kind of didn't think that there was enough chemistry between Colin Firth and Jennifer Earle. Is that how you say it?
I want to say it's Jennifer Ely, but I could be wrong.
Were they dating at this time?
They were something at this time.
Which is crazy. Yeah, I don't know. For some reason, to me, I didn't get it as much with them. But I didn't think that Colin Firth and Jennifer Ely had enough chemistry to sort of make me believe in the romance between them. And watching it play out on screen made me realize just how little foundation there is to the romance.
He just stares at her awkwardly for a year.
Yes, it's just like a lot of staring at and her sort of awkwardly smiling. And it just kind of was starting to make me feel uncomfortable. And, like, by the time that he comes and proposes, I was just as surprised. It's just like, what? Like, no. But I do think it was pretty good. I don't know how much I would rewatch it. So 3 socks for that one. I'm going to risk being shunned by B, but for the 2005...
Good opinion was lost.
It's lost forever.
I know. I give 2 socks to the 2005. I think that this version works best if you've already read the book and you can fill in sort of these gaps because it really does rush through a lot of things and it plays up the romance so much and it cuts out a lot of the humor. And to me, that's not what I enjoyed out of the book. Only 2 socks.
I have no objections to this, but I do not feel quite strongly about either, really, beyond basic enjoyment. So, B, will you enlighten us about your ratings?
Sure. For the book, I do have to give a caveat that I did not reread it for this episode, and the last time I read it was quite a few years ago. So it's based on a years-old memory, but I am going to rate it a 4 like you, Kat. I enjoyed this book very much. It's not one that I reread very often. And I did not feel compelled to read it again for this particular episode.
I feel like I have to note that we make comments like this every so often, and it makes us seem like we're really old. I think we're just very, like, loose with our time.
Sure, we're precautious. We first read it in high school at the age of 3.
Yeah, we're very Agatha Christie in that way. We're just rewriting our histories as we go.
We're Charlotte Lucas aged, more or less, I think. We're not Mrs. Bennet's aged yet. That's a good reference. But yes, this was quite a few years ago, I think, and I'll give it a 4. As for the 95, I will also give it 4 socks. It's very pleasant. I've mentioned before that it's one of my sick day movies because I do not find it very emotionally stirring. This is something very placid, right?
That is very accurate.
You were watching it during your sick days. You don't stress. You just watch the awkward staring, the witty remarks, and you can just sit back and enjoy everything without getting too emotionally involved.
It's very gentle.
Yes, that's
good
true.
word.
Yeah.
That's one of the reasons that I prefer the 2005 movie, which elicits all my emotions. I cannot open my eyes large enough to take everything in. And the score as well by Dario Marinelli, I think it's beautiful. I love the aesthetic of this movie. I will give it a perfect 5 socks. This is definitely in my top 5 movies of all time. I love, unlike you two, every single choice this movie makes, from the casting, all of them, to the cinematography, to the brilliant score that I just mentioned. And fun fact, he also did the score for Paddington 2, among many others. I've seen this movie about 10,000 times. And like I've said in this podcast before, the first proposal scene in particular is one of my all-time favorite movie scenes. The rain, the almost kiss, the tension, the fighting, everything. It works perfectly for me to be one of the greatest scenes, in my opinion.
It is very iconic, I will admit. It's a very sexy scene.
I definitely appreciated seeing the movie because it did make me realize that there is something there between the two of them. Because after the 95 version, like you said, it's very gentle. It doesn't have a lot of emotional depth to it. So I appreciated sort of being brought back in a little bit to their... And that scene was very good.
I
like the almost kiss.
I like my Austen with a bit of Bronte passion.
Yes.
And I think to credit the 2005, they made good choices for Lizzie and Darcy because they aged them appropriately.
Yes.
Because Colin Firth is older than the Darcy of the book, and so is Jennifer Eel. She should only be about 21, and he should be about 27.
That's one of the things I like about the casting.
Yes.
You're saying they're sweaty, and I'm thinking they're teenagers. These are literally 15 and 16-year-olds. They're looking like 15 and 16-year-olds should look. We were sweaty once too.
There would have been a lot of powder at the time that is missing in this film.
You were saying that you don't know why I like this movie so much. I don't either. Frankly, it's like The Matrix and then Pride and Prejudice. I can only assume that it follows from my childhood love of Beauty and the Beast and The Secret Garden, and it sort of built up into the 2005 Pride and Prejudice.
I can see this. I'm sure somewhere there's some, fan cut of this as a Matrix-style sci-fi thing that will be all the things you need.
I have seen the supernatural retelling of Pride and Prejudice, and I've also read the murder mystery version, Death Comes to Pemberley.
I mean, there's a lot of different options to go with, whether in fan fiction or actual published works. So for my ratings, I give the book a 5. As I said, this is my happy book. I didn't assign it, but as I mentioned, I did start rereading after watching the films because I was like, it seems about the right time for a reread. Let's do it now. So I'm about, a quarter of the way through volume 1. And for the 95, I also give it a 5 because this is always my first and one true version. I love this film. And as B mentioned, it's a very good, relaxing film. I could just set it and watch it without really actively watching it because it's got a nice soothing feel to it that I can just enjoy passively. For the 2005, I give it a 4 because I'm not 100% on board with all of the choices, but I do really enjoy it, and it's the one I watch when I just want a taste. So the 95 is my decadent slice, while the 2005 is the petit four of goodness.
It's a good metaphor.
So let's dive into our reading recs. There were plenty of recommendations that I could have made, but I tried to keep this brief to something more general as far as appeal. Firstly, Persuasion, because it is my other favorite Austen work. And we did do a Persuasion episode, as mentioned earlier. So that is episode 4 of this podcast, if you would like to go back and listen to our early attempts at explaining Austen. But I would also like to recommend a contemporary work. This came out about a year and a half ago, 2 years now as of this recording. It's The Hating Game by Sally Thorne, which I think takes a lot of those enemies to lovers tropes that Pride and Prejudice has. It's set in a contemporary setting with 2 people who work in the same department and are vying for the same job. And there's a lot of misunderstandings and stuff like that. It's a very good book. There's a lot of internal monologues that have that snipey feel of Pride and Prejudice, and it's a very enjoyable read. Whether you're into romance or not, there are romance. It is a romance book. There's romance in it, but it's got a lot of interpersonal dynamics and stuff like that. It's a very enjoyable read. And North and South for a Victorian Lizzie Darcy dynamic with way more social justice and sweeping landscapes and more gothic elements, and that is by Elizabeth Gaskell. There's also an excellent BBC miniseries that you can watch, which I think has more of the feel and aesthetic of your 2005 Pride and Prejudice.
I would say it's the halfway point between the 95 and the 05.
That seems legit. And lastly, my weird reverse inspiration for reading Pride and Prejudice, Bridget Jones's Diary, which we covered on episode 16 of the podcast.
As for me, like I said, I've read a lot of these Pride and Prejudice spin-offs, everything from Death Comes to Pemberley to a weird one where they had a supernatural ring that reminded me of Lord of the Rings in some way, to...
I haven't read that one.
to Mr. Darcy's Daughters, to I think all the big ones, and I haven't really liked any of them, so I'm not going to recommend any of those, but they exist. There's a Pride and Prejudice for every genre taste, if you're interested. However, my recommendation is going to be an obligatory one by now, another Jane Austen work, Northanger Abbey, because if I don't recommend it, no one else on this podcast will.
That's the truth.
It's my favorite Austen novel and one of my all-time favorite books. I don't know that I need to summarize it, but maybe I do, Kat?
I don't know it, so yes.
Okay, then I'll summarize it. It's the story of a gothic novel fangirl, Catherine Morland, who in her first foray into society encounters shocking debauchery and terrible misunderstandings that are colored by the colorful books she reads. She also meets the delightful Mr. Tony, who's definitely more in the Bingley mold, I think. Would you agree, Crystal?
Yes, definitely Bingley.
He understands Muslims particularly well, and I also really liked the 2007 adaptation of this book and strongly recommend that as well.
It was a very good adaptation, I will say.
It does add a little bit of the steamy side of Austen.
Yeah, I think the later adaptations from the BBC all upped some of that steam.
My last recommendation this time is a pretty strange one, I think. It's an online comic strip. It's the Hark a Vagrant comic, House Full of Boulders. As we know, my good opinion of The X-Files has been lost forever, but this mishmash of The X-Files and Pride and Prejudice, which stars Scully as Darcy and Mulder as all the Bennet sisters, complete with aluminum foil bonnets, it's never going to fail to make me laugh. So I'll put it in the show notes.
I think that Scully makes a very good Darcy.
Yeah.
Well, for my reading recommendations, I had a kind of a hard time just because I haven't read that many Austen books, obviously, and I haven't read a whole lot of romance. So I was trying to pick up on the elements that I liked from it. And like I mentioned, I liked sort of the commentary, the social commentary of it. So I'm picking something by Edith Wharton, The House of Mirth. And to me, Wharton is sort of an Austen-esque writer, but she's an American. And so she writes about the upper crust American society, particularly in New York. And usually her books take place in the late 1800s, which is during the Gilded Age. And there's just like a lot of excess in New York and in America at that time. So her books are really good and sort of cutting about those kinds of society ills. The House of Mirth tracks the downfall of Lily Bart during that time period, the Gilded Age. And to me, it's sort of like the other side of the coin of Pride and Prejudice. It's almost like what would happen to a woman who doesn't get married, who by a certain age, she's 29 in the book. She's on the sort of outskirts of society. She's not wealthy enough to sort of be set up without being married, but she also is, sort of around these wealthy people. And so she wants to stay in that life and she tries to make a marriage, but various things happen and she keeps falling and basically has to keep degrading herself to various forms of social interactions with men and even and with women, really. She sort of becomes like a social secretary at some points and has to take jobs and just basically try any way to like stay in that world. And it is a tragedy, I will say that. It does not end happily for her. But to me, it's a realistic portrayal of sort of the sad limitations of women, especially unmarried women at that time period.
Yeah, I always think of Edith Wharton as like, these are tragedies all.
All tragedies, which I like. I think reading Pride and Prejudice has made me realize that I don't really like a happy ending.
Oh.
So it made me realize as I was like looking at all of my things and recommendations, I was like, I really like to cry at the end of things. But for my viewing recommendations, the first one is actually not a tragedy, but it's an early British series, Regency House Party. In the early 2000s, British TV and PBS produced a bunch of these historical reenactment reality TV shows that take modern day people and put them in different time periods where they have to live for an extended period of time. All of these shows are amazing. I recommend them all. They're very weird early reality TV, and I wish that they still produce these kinds of things because I really want to be a contestant on one of them. But Regency House Party follows 5 men and 5 women and 4 chaperones and a house full of servants who all take on identities of various social standing throughout a 6-week summer in a country house where they try to make a good match for marriage. And honestly, just describing it does it no justice. It's really a strange show in that it's like a perfect Venn diagram of my interest of historical reenactments and reality dating TV. And it's very weird, but it's fascinating. And the first time I watched it, I had never read Austen. And I rewatched a little bit of it now, and it's filled to the brim with references. The time period, it takes place in 1813. The first episode is called Pride and Prejudice. One of the characters are like, and our Mr. Darcy is so-and-so.
So you're saying they're really
wow.
subtle.
Yeah. I was like, well, I guess I get all of this now. Anyway, it's kind of hard to find, but you can get it from the library in most places. For my last recommendation, it's Fiddler on the Roof. I had just happened to see a live performance of Fiddler on the Roof the week after I read Pride and Prejudice, and it made me realize that Fiddler on the Roof is a version of Pride and Prejudice. It's basically the same exact story with a family, 5 daughters who all want to marry rich men, but then throughout the show realize that they actually want to marry for love. And there's also the sweet father-daughter dynamic and the put-upon mother. It's all there, but also violence and religious persecution
Violence.
And people being forced from their homes. So
Singing, dancing.
there's a lot of singing.
So it gave
there's
you the
a lot of
tragedy
dancing.
you needed.
Yes, there's singing, there's dancing. I cried multiple times. So it's what I want from this story. I highly recommend it. The movie version is very good and it's very distressing just how relevant everything in that movie is at this time in our history.
I think we've established what we're all into
Yes.
in this episode.
Yeah, this is a very illuminating episode.
Yes.
Kat, I am so pleased you have been introduced to the world of Jane Austen.
Yes.
By force. Not by choice.
I'm happy it finally happened.
Yay. concludes this episode of the Bluestocking Circle podcast. For the show notes, visit thebluestockingcircle.com. Find us on Twitter, Tumblr, Instagram, Pinterest, and pretty much everywhere at BlueSockCircle. That's Blue, S-O-X, Circle. Email us at thebluestockingcircle@gmail.com and join the conversation. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, and YouTube, so please rate, review, and subscribe to help us grow.
Cheers!
Before we why can't I use words today? Before we the bees are a problem for us.
Excuse me.
No. I will sniff.
I'm keeping at least one sniff in the course.
Before we continue.
It was a sniff.
There was a sniff. There's going to be more.
Start from the top.
Well, I can't even...
I gotta get them out. I gotta do them while we're in between the moments.